Hi, everyone. Welcome to this informational webinar about how to scaffold powerful and meaningful inquiries. My name is Marie Van Vlies, and I've been a facilitator with the Critical Thinking Consortium, and I've also been a classroom teacher for over a decade. I'm currently completing doctoral studies at the Ontario Institute for Studies in Education in Curriculum and Pedagogy. So, what I'm hoping to help facilitate through this webinar is helping to understand how to use the inquiry packs and how the inquiry pack resources can be very, very powerful ways to bring critical inquiry into your classroom. So, to start us off, I just wanted to give everyone a moment to look at these three different types of questions. So I'll just give you a moment right now to look at these and think about them and try to notice what the differences are between these three different types of questions. And at this point, if you are listening to the recorded webinar, you might want to stop and pause. I'm going to move on, but you might want to stop and pause if you need some more time to think about this question. So, what often comes up in looking at these three different types of questions is that the type one questions are quite factual. They're questions where there is a definitive right answer, and it's a matter of looking the answer up or remembering it, but certainly you can find the answer to that question. In the second type of question, it is more of a personal preference. There is no right or wrong. This is personal opinion. But in the third type of question, you see that there is a need for some form of inquiry. Um, these questions require curiosity, they require investigation. There's some form of criteria that you need to use in order to come up with a reasoned judgment or to come up with a solution or to come up with some possibilities to these questions. The fact is that although there isn't a right or wrong answer, not all answers or solutions are good solutions. And again, you'd use that criteria and you'd use the evidence about how you're meeting that criteria to, to know and to make that assessment. So, for example, the three most inspiring responses to climate change, you'd need to use that criteria of inspiring and justify that using evidence when you're giving your suggestions. So again here, just to review, the type 1 factual recall questions, type 2 the personal preference questions, and finally the type 3 those critical thinking questions. And so what the Inquiry-pac resource does is it frames a very comprehensive critical inquiry that has larger inquiry questions as well as smaller critical challenges all along the way. And what this does is really support students in becoming good decision makers and in becoming better thinkers. So the definition that is used, that's been developed over time by the Critical Thinking Consortium, is that critical thinking is thinking through a problematic situation about what to believe or how to act, where the thinker is making a reasoned judgment that reflects the competent use of the intellectual tools for quality thinking. So, what that means is that you're thinking critically whenever you're presented with this kind of challenge where you've got to decide what to believe or how to act. And in order to make that decision, you are making a reasoned judgment that draws on these intellectual tools. And we're going to explore those intellectual tools and I hope show how framing a critical inquiry, the Inquiry-pac does this very, very well. We're actually supporting the development of those intellectual tools. So along the bottom of this slide here, you'll see examples of those 5 intellectual tools. So, in order to think critically about something, for example, if we're presented with a problem in physics, we're going to need some background knowledge in physics in order to make a really good decision. If we're asked to make a decision about the most sustainable responses to climate change, we're going to need some background knowledge about what are some of the different responses out there. So, we need background knowledge in order to think critically. We also need that criteria for judgment. So, how are we deciding? What does sustainable mean? What does significant mean? What does powerful mean? Helping students understand the vocabulary of thinking. If we're asking them for a reasoned judgment, do they know what a reasoned judgment is? If we're asking them to use supporting evidence, do they know what evidence is, or bias, or proof? So being explicit and really teaching the vocabulary of thinking. When you're making a decision, it's always helpful to have some form of a thinking strategy. And I'll show you some examples in this webinar of some thinking strategies. And there's thousands of them. It's ways that we might make a decision. For example, a Venn diagram, a rating scale, a pro-con chart. These are all examples of different kinds of thinking strategies. And finally, habits of mind of good thinking. Are you able to think independently? Do you consider diverse perspectives before making a decision? Are you aware of bias, and do you try to counter your bias? Are you empathic? Do you pay attention to detail? Are you able to persevere? So explicitly nurturing those habits of mind is also really important. And again, the inquiry packs really do develop this. And I'm going to help to, I hope, share with you how they do that. So when we're creating the conditions for critical inquiry, we do that in the following ways. So one is that we frame tasks and questions that actually problematize the content. We involve students in shaping the questions to guide their inquiry. We give students ownership over the directions of their investigations. And we're requiring that they critically analyze, not merely retrieve information. We assemble multiple resources and perspectives so that students can incorporate those into their own decision making. We accept and welcome differing and alternative perspectives. We are explicitly teaching those tools to students, the quality thinking tools. We're shifting the focus of assessment from the right answer to the quality of thinking, to well thought out, well justified explanations, to expertly using evidence. We're using the content of the discipline, whatever it is, geography, mathematics, humanities, the arts, physical education, to inform thinking about everyday issues and actions. And we're nurturing students to self-regulate in their use of those thinking strategies. So we want to see them using those strategies independently. And again, this shift and the whole inquiry packs are framed around thinking critically about the subject. So you must interpret and assess the information in textbooks, not just take it in. And from other sources, moving beyond the textbook, we're reaching one's own reasoned conclusions using the available information. And we're questioning the data, the information that's found in the different sources. So the inquiry packs have all been framed in the following ways. The first way, and actually I'll just go back for a moment, is what is the big idea or concept or central question that students will take away from this unit or course to life beyond the course, and it's going to nurture active engagement in their communities? How do we bring the curriculum to life? How do we develop some really powerful questions that will support students in bringing the curriculum to life? What's a critical challenge, a project, or a capstone that's going to drive the learning for this course, for this unit, for this subject? And what are we going to accept as a powerful demonstration of learning? How do we know students have been successful? And then we're going to frame some inquiry questions that flow out of these central overarching questions and challenges and feedback into it as well. And so again, we can have 2, 3 lines of inquiry that all flow out of this. So again, I'm going to be giving you some examples so you can see this coming to life. This is an example of what the face of the grade 5 Inquiry-pac looks like. So when you log in with your code and you go, we have the different Inquiry-pacs. I'm going to share primarily the grade 7 Geography Inquiry-pac with you because I did help to develop that resource. I'm most familiar with it, but I'm also drawing on some examples from one of the grade 2 Inquiry-pacs as well as the grade 5 Inquiry-pac. So what you'll notice when you go to the Inquiry-pac website is you will see the unit overview. So this will tell you what's that overarching question. Well, it's here. What is government doing well and where is more work needed? And the critical challenge is, this is for the line of inquiry 1, is to create a progress report that assesses actions taken by government on a pressing social or environmental problem. And as part of the report, propose a government action plan. And you'll see in this first line of inquiry, we have all of the lessons, 6 lessons. The outline tells you here there's a summary of the lesson objectives that you see are directly matched to the curriculum. And then you can download all of the core material. So this includes the PowerPoint presentation slides, teaching notes, and activity and instruction sheets, which are available in both Word that you can edit and PDF. Okay, and again, here is an example of the grade 2, the launch lesson that launches students right into the inquiry. And again, giving you that description, the summary, the objectives, and all of the materials that you can download for that lesson. So everything that you need that you can tweak yourself. You can use some of the key structures, you can use pieces, but this gives you everything you need for a very robust inquiry. Here's an example, just so you see, of what the teaching notes look like. They're very comprehensive and detailed. Okay, they tell you what the overarching question for that lesson is, what it is you're doing, the objectives, and then it also walks you through prompts for each of the slides. So again, you can play with this, but this gives you a structure to support you in scaffolding student thinking and critical inquiry. Here, you're going to see the effective launch. So when you start a critical inquiry, one of the ideas is that previously, how we've often gotten students engaged in thinking is we feel like we need to teach them a bunch of stuff first, and then if we have time, we get them to think about it. But here we want to launch students into the learning right away. So we get them hypothesizing or critiquing or imagining or designing right off the bat. And that becomes the central core that they come back to and they revisit again and again through the inquiry process. So I'll give you an example of what this looks like. So in the grade 7 inquiry, because the critical challenge is to create a compelling message to the world, the very first day in a thought book, you ask them, if you had to draft a message to the world that shares one key idea and one inspiring example to help us respond to our changing environment, what would that be? And the students record that initial message and then share it with a partner. And then what you'll see is as they start to move through the critical inquiry and the lessons and they come back and they keep revisiting it, it's amazing to see how students start to recognize, oh, my thinking wasn't very developed. I don't have very much geographic evidence. I haven't really used criteria, and they start to develop independently those quality thinking tools for themselves. Right off the bat, we give them a message. This is Kat Martinez, very popular youth leader right now around the Fridays for Future, Earth Guardians, doing a lot of work around climate change and climate change activism. So this is a video that you can watch with the students and you get them thinking about it, speculating. He said, what better time to be born than now? Well, think of reasons to support the claim. Do you agree with the claim? Again, turning this into thinking prompts for students, not just passively watching a video, but asking them, do you agree? Do you disagree? What evidence can you use to support your thinking? Here is from grade 5. The unit launch is to use words and pictures to imagine an ideal solution to a pressing problem, because what the students have to do in the grade 5 critical inquiry unit is to develop an ideal solution to a problem. So you get them doing that right from the very beginning. Grade 2, students have to determine what makes their family special. So right off the bat, what is it that makes your family special? Think about families in the Family Book by Todd Parr and get them involved in that thinking from the very first day. Nurture the quality thinking by designing an effective overarching challenge. Okay, so we have an overarching question, but we have this overarching challenge. So when we're developing an overarching inquiry question, we want to invite students to explore an idea or issue. So you can think about the examples I've just shared with you and reflect on how they do that. It should have broad generative or predictive powers. It's not something that can be answered in a yes or no. It's not something that can be looked up. If we are trying to consider how we should respond to our changing environment, that's broad, that's generative, that involves a lot of thinking. There isn't a definitive answer to that question. That is going to encourage exploration of important concepts and issues in the subject of geography. And it's going to support nurturing the competencies related to your subject area. So again, the inquiry packs have done that. They have helped develop an overarching inquiry question. For grade 7, how should we respond to our changing Earth? For grade 2, what is important about our similarities and differences? For grade 5, what are the most effective ways citizens and governments can ensure that our community, province, and country are good places to live? So an effective overarching critical challenge is an authentic performance task. It simulates life outside of school and has an audience beyond the teacher in the classroom. And it requires students to demonstrate their learning through a performance or the creation of a product. So the authenticity of a really good critical challenge. And again, this has been built into the Inquiry-pac. So these are some examples you can use in other subjects, but we've also framed them in, you'll see some of these examples in the Inquiry-pacs themselves. So creating a board game, designing an app, writing a children's story, designing an artistic and accurate map, publishing a magazine, creating an improved timeline of past, present, and future environmental change, revising a video, putting a concept on trial, designing a sustainable model, and proposing a solution to a global issue, and creating a message to the world. So rather than proof of learning, the task, the critical challenge itself becomes the driver for the learning. It is inviting students to learn. And based around that critical challenge, the teacher is choreographing the learning experience. And again, the structure of the Inquiry-pacs helps in doing so. So you'll see here, grade 7, overarching question, how should we respond to our changing Earth? The critical challenge, create a compelling multimedia message to the world to communicate powerful ideas and inspiring examples that will help us to respond sustainably to our changing Earth. For grade 5, what are the most effective ways citizens and governments can ensure that our community, province, and country are good places to live? The challenge is to create an engaging and informative call to action aimed at convincing a selected audience to support your proposed plans for addressing a specific issue. So starting to see this authenticity, this goes beyond the classroom, right? This invites the community in and invites the students out at the same time. Grade 2, what is important about our similarities and differences? Explain and thoughtfully comment on 2 of the important similarities and differences included by others in the classroom tribute book. something collective for students to have, something to share, something that visitors to the classroom can see, that parents can be invited into and to be a part of. So there we have these critical challenges framed around authenticity. And what I also wanted to show, an example from grade 7 that shows up in all of the inquiry packs, is you see along the left here the um, the overarching expectations for grade 7. And then along the right, you'll see that these have been translated by us into specific look-fors that are then used for assessment. Okay, so we take those overarching expectations and now they become look-fors in the classroom. So thoughtfully analyzing some challenges and opportunities. Are we seeing evidence of making meaningful connections? Are they demonstrating critically minded and curiosity when learning about the planet? So now that these have become look-fors, we have our assessment all lined up, and it is lined up around thinking. So we are supporting students in nurturing really strong disciplinary and quality thinking. I wanted to give you some examples of some of the lesson challenges, both larger lesson challenges and mini challenges. So you see how those critical thinking questions are embedded throughout these inquiry packs. So imagine you've got students and you put up this slide and you're inviting their thinking. Why is the climate changing? What are the factors contributing to changing climate patterns? And we're bringing in the disciplinary geographic thinking. What do we see here? Interrelationships, patterns and trends, spatial significance, or geographic perspectives? Another example of a critical challenge: how might the map be improved? Getting students to look at maps, building the mapping skills in students, but framing it as a thinking task. What changes would more effectively communicate the need to respond to changing climate patterns? So we start to get it in this lesson challenge, developing some thoughtful annotations. Right? Helping students read maps effectively. So noticing how we're building disciplinary knowledge and skills as we're engaging students in some critical thinking challenges. Again, confirming the location. So here there are graphs around precipitation, and this lesson is very much built around helping students understand different climate zones. And we use thinking prompts to do that. So we're building the geographic literacy. The students are looking at the diverse precipitation and temperature patterns and which of the locations here are the best map. And so they start to be able to map and visualize different climate patterns. So again, thinking about the larger question, how should we respond to our changing Earth? And now going right into the very specific geographic concepts, the disciplinary concepts and skills that keep feeding back into that overarching question and into that challenge. This is from the second line of inquiry around which would be the most sustainable response to climate change. Here, we're building out the criteria for a sustainable response, that it's effective, realistic, and fair, and that students are proposing responses to climate change, looking at these different responses, ranking them based on their preliminary thinking, then providing additional background information on each of these, and then having students use supporting evidence to determine whether they would change their rankings. So you see how the thinking is woven throughout. Here is an example from the grade 5 inquiry pack of a thinking strategy. So you see that we have the problem, actions, and the criteria along the left, and then evidence. Evidence that the actions are effective, evidence that the actions are not effective, and then a rating. And so you see that this becomes a strategy that can help students in making good decisions, and that's what a good thinking strategy does. So there's many different examples of these kinds of thinking strategies woven throughout the inquiry pack. And here's an example right from the classroom. This is from grade 7, and students have, in this case, watched a film about how the Inuit respond to their changing natural landscape. And you see how you have the criteria. The student checks which of the criteria, whether which idea is the most powerful. So they're using here the criteria for a powerful idea, which is in the top right-hand corner. They're assessing A, B, C, and D options. They're checking which elements of the criteria and using evidence. So you can see how this structure scaffolds quality thinking, that students don't just pick anything, but they're using the criteria to help them decide. They're using then evidence to show how they've used that criteria, where the elements of that criteria are actually there. Then they're picking their idea and, again, using their reasoned judgment. So you'll see this student said, the most powerful idea is C. Take advantage of opportunities in your environment because it's a worldwide message that can be used and learned all over the world. Plus, it's easy to remember. This idea also is a powerful instruction that may help change the environment around you, and it is very motivating. So you start to see how they're using the criteria itself in their reasoned judgment, and how this thinking strategy really scaffolds and supports students to build that. And that's why it's really, really important, and why the inquiry pack is very helpful. One of the most helpful things is not only that these critical challenges are prepared, but that you have these thinking strategies there. What does this look like at the grade 2 level? What does a thinking strategy look like? Well, obviously more simple. How might our families be similar and different? So here, it's about recording 2 important ideas you might use on your finished pages. So just again, providing a place where students can record their thinking, start to organize their thinking, start to develop that idea to consider what is important. Is this the most important idea of the 4 different ideas I have here? Which 2 do I think are most important? And again, seeing how that scaffolding is being built right into the design itself. And again, I wanted to share in the grade 2, and there are different elements of this. They look different for grade 5 as well as for grade 7, but the self-assessment pieces at the end of each lesson. So for the grade 2s, you're using the stop light colors here, and the students color this in, and they can hand it back to the teacher, and you'll see how this operates as a kind of exit card, really, that gives the teacher information about how the learning is going. So this big idea of all families are similar and different in some way. And the student can think about this and decide, am I confused? Do I understand this idea a little bit, or I understand this idea a lot? And again, this shows up in different ways, but there's all these opportunities for self-assessment of the learning in all of the inquiry packs, and it's built right in. So why engage in critical inquiry? One of the key reasons, and there is a good amount of research that does support this idea. One study was done by Newman and a series of other researchers. I believe it was in 1995, but don't quote me on that. I apologize that that's escaping me at the moment. But the research does continue to share with us and show us that when students are involved in active learning, when they're constructing meaning, when they're invited to construct meaning, and they're invited to deeply think about things, that this does, in fact, engage them intellectually, academically. And so when we're talking about meaningful engagement and we want to, when we're looking at this taxonomy, I'm showing you at the very top notions or conceptions of students feeling transformed by the learning, being empowered by that learning, something that is memorable, something that is in fact deep, that to challenge students, which is right below here, to challenge them where they're caught up in their learning or empowered, we need to be engaging them in critical, collaborative, and creative thinking in some way. And so you see on this taxonomy that at the very bottom, we have students who are compliant, they're on task. Or as we move up, they're interested or entertained, they care or appreciate the value. But as we move up to challenge and transformed, they are on task, they are interested, they do care, but they're also really challenged and empowered by that learning. And again, the research is showing us that, helping us understand that it's when we are inviting students and creating these kinds of meaningful opportunities for them to engage in critical, collaborative, and creative thinking, that's where we're going to hit those higher levels of engagement in students. So I want to give you an example. Remember going back to the launch that I shared with you on the very first day, where we had students in the grade 7 Inquiry-pac on the very first day writing their message to the world. So this is an example taken right from a student with their permission. This was their message on the first day. My message to the world is to stop destroying forests and wildlife just to build condos and parking lots. I cannot give a specific example as this is happening way too much, but to help stop this, make more wildlife and plant more trees. Okay, so if we look at this engagement taxonomy, we might put the student up at the cares and appreciating the value, right? The student is showing some care. If we're looking at this through the lens of geographic disciplinary thinking and assessment, well, I think it's fair to say that, at this point, we're not seeing necessarily a lot of sophisticated geographic disciplinary thinking here. We're not seeing geographic evidence. We're not seeing students thinking in terms of patterns and trends and spatial relationships, the ethical dimensions. We're not really seeing examples of this, right? Because this is the very first day. So imagine now, after going through a series of lessons built around critical challenges that feed back into that central challenge of creating your compelling message to the world that includes powerful ideas and sustainable, inspiring responses. Think about as you continue to move through that, what will happen. And again, this is the case for all of the Inquiry-pacs, that students are engaging in this, throughout. So I want to share with you, this isn't the student's compelling message to the world because those ended up being quite long. I have, 10-minute, 8 to 12-minute videos that a lot of students recorded, and I'm not going to share that with you, but I did want to share their reflection on the learning process. So this is the same student whose initial message I just shared. And so here we're having the students say, I've learned to be effective in my communication. I really have to show strong evidence to support my ideas. I learned how to find credible and relevant geographic evidence and how this strengthens what I'm saying. So let's just focus on this piece for a moment before going further. Thinking about how the student is now metacognitively aware of their thinking and aware of what it means to be a quality thinker, the need for this strong evidence, the idea that it needs to be credible and understanding what credible means here, and relevant geographic evidence, and how this strengthens what they're saying. And now the student goes on to say, This was an amazing learning experience. I feel changed. In the past, I was taught that yes, climate change exists, but it felt like something out there, something that others would deal with. I now understand in detail what contributes to the issue and what its impacts are. I also see that I can join others to be part of the solution. I am committed to making changes and making a real difference. So, again, let's think back to this idea of an authentic challenge, something that invites the world into the classroom and leads the students out. And that's here. This is what the student is describing. They are, you see a sense of active citizenship that's been nurtured, not just this issue that is removed from them, but now something that they feel empowered that they can get involved in, that they can be part of solutions, that they can be problem solvers. So the authenticity and empowerment that has come from deeper engagements, deeper understandings, and deeper learning. And that's part of the power of engaging students in these active, constructivist pedagogies, right? So the student has been, we're not just seeing a student on task in their comments. We're not just seeing that they've interested or that they care, but we're seeing that they have been caught up and transformed by the learning that they've done through the course of that critical inquiry. So how, again, let's take another closer look at how we got from the first answer. So I'm going to go back. How do we get from that answer to a student metacognitively aware and also showing a greater level of sophistication in the discipline itself? So how did that happen? So again, the student was engaged through the critical inquiry unit with critical, collaborative, and creative thinking. So what are the practices that are woven into all of the critical inquiry units that support meaningful engagement? One is that they provide more compelling learning opportunities. And thinking of the difference between a traditional test in geography versus creating a real life message to the world that goes out. Where in the case in my own classroom, we invited parents, community leaders, members of parliaments, representatives from different political parties, members and staff members from different environmental organizations. So think about the difference when students are knowing that people in the community are coming to listen, to hear what they have to say, that their voice has value, versus writing a test. Which is the more compelling learning experience? Nurturing supportive classroom, school, home, and virtual spaces for their engagement. So bringing the students' genuine interest into the inquiry, the things that they care about. Developing the tools to match the challenge. So you'll see, thinking back to the powerful idea thinking strategy, when the student has to think about a powerful idea, nurturing the tool of knowing the criteria for a powerful idea, nurturing the tool of the critical thinking vocabulary of providing supporting evidence, the tools are aligned with the challenges themselves. Establish mechanisms to learn about student views. So inviting students, and you saw that in some of the previous slides where students are invited to talk to each other before they share with the class, that their voice, their thinking is a central dimension of what is happening in the classroom. And also, students are engaged when the feedback is timely, when it's helpful, and when it's encouraging. It's not very helpful to get feedback at the end of a process because the students have nothing really authentic and relevant to apply it to. But if they're developing their message to the world and they're sharing that with you and you're providing them with meaningful feedback, then that's something they apply to this learning that they are actively engaged with. So consider right now your own practices in light of this principle of meaningful engagement. And think about how you might affirm what you're already doing here, because absolutely you're already doing a number of these things. Are there some things here that you would like to refine a little bit, realizing, I'm not sure I'm matching intellectual tools to some of my challenges? And then to consider what you aspire to do. So considering your own practices in light of this principle. And again, I invite you, if you're listening into this webinar, this might be a moment that you want to pause the webinar, take a few moments, reflect on this question, and then resume. What we know, again, returning to some of the research, is that it is by working on complex problems that brain connections really develop. So what we practice is what we become good at. So if we are practicing how to be a really good thinker and decision maker, we will get better at doing that. If we're practicing using really strong, credible supporting evidence to support our reasoning, we will become better at that. If we are practicing being curious and open-minded and integrating different perspectives into our own thinking, we will become better at that. So the thought book is something that I shared with you at the very beginning, and this is again a central feature of all of the inquiry packs. So the thought book becomes that space for students. It's not a notebook, it's the space where students continue to reflect, refine, develop, revisit their thinking. So with the grade 7, using the grade 7 as an example, we have that original message to the world, and we have the student continuing to revisit as they're building their geographic knowledge, as they're learning more about geographic evidence. They come back, they keep building, revisiting, revising their message. It's powerful for assessment as learning. It's not something I ever marked. With the thought book or thought space, and again, it takes different forms in the different grades and in the different inquiry packs, but it is this powerful tool for observation, seeing what students are writing, what they're thinking, for conversation, and to provide feedback. Again, not a grade, because this is really about process, but that you can see where their thinking has become visible to you. You can see how they're using criteria to make their decisions. And it can be very helpful, when you are evaluating students at the end and you have that thought book and you can really get a sense of the thinking that they've done throughout. Here's an example of one student's thought book. Again, this is from the grade 7. You start to see that they're listing powerful ideas, they're highlighting different things, they're developing ideas about things they want to include in their message to the world. You can see, for example, in the corner, they're talking about the Dogon people, indigenous peoples, how they're living in relationship to their natural environment. So you see them continuing to build that background knowledge. I love how in this case you see the date that the student is sort of tracking, right? You see a little bit of the criteria on the same page of ideas, concise, comprehensive, right? They're building their ability to develop a really powerful message to the world. Again, coming back to how we use these lesson challenges throughout the course of the inquiry pack to help them develop this kind of disciplinary thinking. how we're building their capacity to use the tools that we introduced at the beginning of this webinar, those intellectual tools like thinking vocabulary, evidence or conclusion. Well, students often don't know what the difference is. So we've built this right into the lesson at the same time that students are developing the disciplinary geographic knowledge in this particular case, right? So you see the thinking prompt. Decide which column lists evidence and which column lists conclusions. Share your decision with a partner. There's some collaborative thinking. There's student voice. Draft an initial definition of each word. Active constructivist pedagogies, not just giving them the definition. Draft and share your definition with a partner. And then, after they've done that, we provide a definition for each, ask the students to review, decide how well their definitions match these previous ideas, anything they want to add or change to their own or to the ones provided here, again, integrating student voice and student thinking, and discuss your decisions with the class. So again, the knowledge, this background knowledge, the thinking vocabulary knowledge combined with the geographic disciplinary knowledge and the constructivist pedagogy here comes so that students are being very active and learning about the difference between evidence and conclusion. So when you think back to that student who was much more metacognitively aware at the end of the unit, where he described using credible, relevant geographic evidence, you can see how this has been explicitly, intentionally scaffolded throughout the critical inquiry. It's part of the critical inquiry. It's woven in so that this is part of how the learning is proceeding. Another example, how you can take a simple prompt, like you're asking students to read a passage from a briefing sheet. You can tweak that into a simple prompt, highlight the most useful pieces of geographic evidence from the text. So that now, a task that was a reading task becomes a thinking task. Highlight the most useful piece. You're nurturing students to A, make some decisions involving criteria, thinking through the reading as they're doing it to decide, well, what's the most useful piece, reiterating the concept of geographic evidence, inviting them to think more deeply about what it is they're reading. So again, a very simple prompt can continue to build and scaffold this richness, this conceptual and thinking richness for students. And then giving them different examples. What is evidence? We gather evidence through research, through observation, through experiments, and we convey geographic evidence through words spoken or text, photographs, video clips, maps, graphs, tables of data, drawings, diagrams. So again, thinking back to that map we had where students were asked to make meaningful annotations, they start to recognize, wow, that is some credible geographic evidence, video clips. So when they're creating their own message, they're able to pull and support their thinking, the claims that they are making, with some sound and credible geographic evidence. So they're being explicitly taught this tool. They're being explicitly taught what this means. So again, thinking back to our student, the metacognitive awareness about evidence, you can see again how this has been scaffolded throughout the process. Another invitation to deepen the learning. Students watch a video about an area in the Philippines in this case, where they have applied different principles to bring an area back to life. There's a conclusion from the video that's been highlighted here. And as they're watching, now they are identifying examples of geographic evidence to support the conclusion that was made above. There's a thinking strategy sheet around analyzing the geographic evidence that they're using to scaffold them in this process. So you see how it continues to build and how that self-regulation, that independence is being nurtured here. So first, we give some examples of evidence, we build our definition of evidence. Now we develop a more challenging context to practice. We're given a conclusion and we have to observe the video. And again, thinking about how, as they watch the video, given this thinking prompt they've been invited into, they aren't just watching this video passively, but they are thinking. They are thinking about examples. Is that an example of geographic evidence that supports this conclusion? They've got a thinking strategy sheet. So you've now taken what can typically be a fairly transmissive approach, or if there's sort of questions that are more type 1 questions on a sheet, that it doesn't invite the same depth of thinking as this kind of a task does. And then again, continuing to build. So here we have two definitions or two captions. The two definitions are in the bottom right-hand corner: geographic facts, pieces of information linked to places on our surface, and they become geographic evidence when they're used to form or defend a conclusion. So reading the definitions, decide which caption makes the photo a stronger piece of geographic evidence. So again, thinking of the central challenge, a compelling message to the world, how this task is building students' ability when they're developing their message, when they're forming and communicating their conclusions, to support those conclusions with sound and credible geographic evidence. So now you start to see how this is happening for students, how they start to build this awareness and understanding. Here's an example of when you revisit the message. After you do this learning about geographic evidence, you revisit the draft message. You propose 3 pieces of geographic evidence that might support your conclusions. You describe your proposed pieces of evidence and you share your thinking with your partner. So again, you don't just do this at the very end of the unit. You're thinking of that message. It's the driver of the learning, that compelling message to the world. You're building your knowledge of evidence. You're coming back to it. And again, I'm using the grade 7 as an example, but this kind of a structure is embedded, looking different, but is embedded in all of the inquiry packs, right? Again, more examples using images. What evidence of environmental change do you see? Which one is more recent? How do you know? Helping students develop the sense of the geographic, disciplinary thinking of patterns and trends over time. Which aspects of the environment have changed? So using the 4, again, the disciplinary knowledge. Is it climate? Is it vegetation? Is it landforms? Is it water? Or more than one, obviously, for them to discuss. So you see how thinking combined with disciplinary knowledge, active constructivist tasks, deepen the learning. And again, coming back to the inquiry pack, it has all of this here. The unit overview will share with you the overarching inquiry question, the overarching critical challenge, the big ideas being explored, the line 1 inquiry here on the right, living with a natural environment. What can we learn from effective responses to the natural environment? A critical challenge for that line of inquiry. The second line of inquiry with an inquiry question and a critical challenge, all leading back though to the overarching inquiry question and overarching critical challenge. So you see how they really flow out. The curriculum cascades. That's what we call it, the cascading curriculum. It cascades out of that overarching inquiry question. It cascades out of the overarching critical challenge. Okay, so this is what's available, and also just wanting to share with you a reminder of the tools for thought lessons that also build and support the development of the critical inquiry and nurturing student thinking. I hope that you have been able to get a better idea of how the inquiry packs work, what their structure is, the thinking behind them. Again, you can use the entire inquiry pack or you can use sections of it. You can take some teachers take the overarching inquiry question, critical challenge, some of the resources, but then frame their own, bring some community specific materials or resources that they've developed and like to use. And of course, that's within your judgment to use that and figure that out. But there is some really useful frames in those inquiry packs to support you. It is important to note that some of the inquiry packs were developed before the most recent change in the curriculum that incorporates more Indigenous perspectives. So a number of them do need some supplementary information to be included. The grade 7 is one that doesn't. It hasn't changed very much, and it does incorporate a number of Indigenous perspectives. So again, I hope that you have been able to get a better sense of the inquiry pack and how you might use them, and again, some of the thinking behind the inquiry pack. So I wish you the best of luck in nurturing student thinking and making these authentic, meaningful challenges for students and bringing the big ideas and the big questions and real world issues to life for them. So thank you very much.